Hi everyone, I'm Zeynep Abes. I'm a PhD student at the University of Southern California in their Media Arts and Practice program. And I'm incredibly excited to you today to present about this topic on preserving virtual reality. Now, VR, it has become a very popular medium within the last decade, but few realize that it does have a very long and very rich history of development that emerged out of early prototypes by research labs and artists and developers, inventors. And although this sort of new wave of immersive media projects that came about after 2014, it has been recognized on a mainstream level. The majority of these projects, they have really been ignored by institutional archives. And we're sort of in this huge danger of losing this work. And I think continuing to build knowledge and community engagement within this field is very crucial to deal with this immediate problem of caring for VR projects and artworks. Um, and this issue of archiving in media art, as you know, most of you might be able to guess, it's not unique to virtual reality. We've really seen this happen throughout the history of film, photography, of all kinds of different interactive media projects and games, for example. But specifically, for example, in film, according to the Library of Congress, about 75% of all silent films have been lost. That's been made before the 1930s. And the particular reason for this was because film really wasn't considered at the time to have much future value or lasting significance. And most films were even intentionally destroyed to avoid spending money on storage space and sort of the expensive upkeep of these materials. And we've seen this pattern sort of take place in other forms of media art, for example, in gaming as well. So, for example, with gaming archives, there is a few, institutionally supported ones out there. However, majority of them are fan-driven efforts. There are, online databases, all kind of emulation websites, or some people or some developers, they do tend to preserve the source code and whatnot. And so there is these efforts and initiatives out there that we're seeing in universities, but again, a lot of them are really just supported by fan-driven efforts. And regardless of this, there's still these thousands of like independently made games that are already lost or in danger of being lost because we, depend on a lot of these devotees to maintain and update these online libraries or emulation sites so that they can continue to run on modern computer systems. And one of the things to consider when looking at this is also, the preservation of hardware is as important as the content itself. And so when we start talking about preserving VR after looking at the history of similar mediums, um, one of like the particularly unique challenges that comes up is the fact that VR, it's designed with majority of VR experiences, they're designed with interface, hardware, and software in mind. And unlike films and games that can really be universally archived in formats that are can be played on any sort of create screen or any sort of 2D format, the majority of VR experiences, they're really designed to run on very specific hardware. And this issue of the lack of standardization within VR development, it plays a very critical role when it comes to migrating the works in the future. And considering how rapidly the medium really has evolved, it is very difficult to identify a standard of best practices for preservation. So, immersive media or VR, it can really, has all kinds of different approaches to it that uses different devices. So, for example, there's 360 cameras, there's editing softwares, there's gaming engines, there's plugins, runtimes, all kinds of different headsets. And because the culture of Silicon Valley is very much intertwined with this, so the constant discontinuation of certain softwares and devices, this causes a very big issue when it comes to trying to update works. So, as you can imagine, once a headset is no longer supported, the dedicated VR experience tends to also disappear with it. So a lot of these VR projects, they become orphaned unless they're continually updated for newer systems. And unfortunately, the majority of independent developers and creators, they don't have the resources, the time, or the budget to keep up with this constant turnover rate of new hardware. And you not to mention the lack of infrastructure that really prevents content creators from ensuring the longevity of titles that are not necessarily positioned with financial gain. So as I mentioned, this sort of competition between big tech companies and this constant turnover rate for newer, better headsets, it tends to leave behind a lot of VR works that are unable to kind of continue to keep up with how fast Silicon Valley tends to produce these different hardwares. And the other thing that I've been noticing, having worked in this in the immersive media community as a curator, a lot of the works that kind of push VR to the mainstream that are narrative driven. So a lot of the works that came from documentary filmmakers and immersive journalists and whatnot that have been shown around in festivals around the world. They're the ones that are losing support the fastest because they're not necessarily positioned to make money. So, for example, I'm already seeing this shift happening in the Oculus store as, it's this highly curated storefront for VR titles, and it's definitely biased towards these money-driven gaming titles, and it leaves very little room for narrative experiences. And most of the narrative work on the store, it comes from these very established immersive studios like Nova Lab or Felix and Paul and the late Oculus Story studio. And although these works from these studios, they're award-winning content and they've had considerable impact on storytelling, but the lack of access to smaller titles just caused a huge number of hidden gems to be left behind to fade with older machines. And this is where I think this pattern that we've sort of been seeing in archiving in media art, unless it's considered an art form, you don't necessarily find support to be able to preserve these works. So major art museums and cultural heritage institutions, they're becoming more inclined to consider how these works will be archived for the future. But one of the biggest challenges for VR is achieving this full acceptance as an art form. There is resistance against buying and preserving immersive works since collectors are hesitant about the longevity of the medium. And unfortunately, the saleability of VR within the art market, it does contribute to how museums and institutions will eventually want to invest in preserving the medium. And the afterlife of a lot of these softwares and hardwares and devices and whatnot, it's also kind of interesting because you see how sort of these big tech companies have so much control over what gets to stay and what doesn't. For example, Google and Samsung, they used to lead the game in mobile headsets with the Daydream and the Gear VR, and they funded all kinds of creator initiatives and all kinds of projects. Only to discontinue the hardware within a few years. And I think because these companies, they used community building as sort of a marketing tactic to get more people to get into using the medium, get into creating with the medium, and then suddenly leaving the community behind by completely shutting down and discontinuing what they're doing. It's an incredibly insincere approach to community building in general. And I think it's really important to be able to hold accountable these tech companies because, again, if they get to decide what gets to stay and what doesn't, we're all aware that archives are not neutral. They are a product of their dominant culture. And if people will surely not really get a clear understanding of the systems of oppression within the history of immersive media if we continue to allow them to decide what happens when it comes to archiving these works. And this really brings me to the project we're working on at USC's Mobile and Environmental Media Lab. So the VR Archive Project, it's an initiative to restore and exhibit the seminal works from across virtual reality's rich history. And so what we're really focusing on is being able to establish an archive for immersive artworks within the university. And the first project we kind of started with was Morton Heilig's Symposium, which was incredibly exciting because it actually exists physically at the USC's archive, the HMH Foundation of Moving Image Archive. And Mort Heilig, he's one of, he's cited as one of VR's first practitioners. And so we've sort of been working on collecting all the artifacts around the development of the Sensorama and also digitizing the works for people to be able to see in modern headsets. And after this, what really brought us, as we were kind of going through the history of virtual reality, we eventually started working on Ivan Sutherland's Sword of Damocles, which has been really exciting. And what we're focusing on right now is really the establishing this sort of foundations of early XR research and development, on focusing on projects that laid down the first tracks of this comprehensive digital archive of the source materials of VR's history. And eventually the next projects for the future, as we go through, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, we're incredibly excited to dive into these other incredible works, but eventually make our way into the works that came about the past decade, which, as you could all imagine, after 2014 we had like this boom of VR projects from around the world, and a lot of the narrative work and gaming as well, of course. We're very excited to be able to create an archive that can be accessed by students to be able to look at the work and learn how to better develop, storytelling skills and whatnot within, immersive media. And I think in order to really imagine an archive, we really have to first imagine these new processes and new techniques for archiving, and design viable solutions for translating and transferring sort of these historical XR projects into a preservable format and system. And in general, we're still in the early beginning stages of this project, but we're looking for collaborators, possibly with other universities or institutions who are interested in supporting the preservation of VR projects and artworks, basically from across the world. Thank you so much for listening, and please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any further questions. Thank you.